You know that feeling? You're just trying to do something simple, maybe change the settings on your TV remote or find a specific feature in an app you use every day.
Yeah.
And you just can't. The interface fights you, it's confusing, and you end up feeling like, well, like you're the one who's not smart enough.
Or you land on a website, right?
Yeah,
You need one key piece of information, like right now, and it feels like you're navigating a maze.
totally.
Buttons aren't obvious. The navigation makes zero sense. The text is impossible to scan quickly. It just feels, well, illogical. Like no thought went into how you'd actually use it.
Absolutely. And that frustration, that sense of things just not working the way you expect, it almost always boils down to one fundamental thing, doesn't it? Behind every product, every app, every website, every single designed experience, there's a human brain that has to interact with it.
Right.
And if the design doesn't align with how that brain actually works, you just get friction. You get problems.
And that's precisely what we're getting into today in this deep dive. We're pulling insights from a fantastic source, excerpts from the book 100 Things Every Designer Needs to Know About People by Susan Weinschenk.
Okay.
It's a really accessible look at some fascinating research from psychology, behavioral science, applied directly to understanding, why people do what they do when they interact with the world, especially the designed world.
So think of our mission today as creating maybe a sort of user manual for the human mind.
Yeah, I like that. A user manual.
We want to pull out the most important, maybe the most surprising nuggets from this material to help you, the listener, understand the fundamental principles behind why people behave the way they do with products, systems, information.
Why do they look there? Why do they miss something that seems totally obvious?
Right. What makes something click instantly versus feeling like a total chore?
And this isn't just, academic theory. These insights are incredibly practical, definitely. Whether you're building software, creating presentations, writing marketing copy, leading a team, or honestly, just trying to better understand yourself and the people you interact with every day.
Okay, great. So let's jump right into our first big area then. This gets into how our sort of primal brain processes the world, how we actually see things, and what grabs our attention.
Right.
Because we like to think we see everything in front of us, right? Just take it all in. But the book makes it clear seeing is, well, it's a lot more complex than just having your eyes open.
That's where this distinction between central and peripheral vision gets really interesting.
Okay.
So central vision is what you use to focus on detail, like reading text or looking directly at a tiny object.
Right, the sharp focus bit.
Exactly. But your peripheral vision, everything outside that narrow cone of focus, is actually crucial for getting the gist of a scene or a web page.
The overall feel.
Yeah. We use it way more than we realize. Research cited in the book, like studies from Larson and Laschke, actually showed people could understand what a photo was better when the center was blurred out compared to when the edges were blurred.
Wow, okay. So the stuff on the sidelines, the periphery, matters more for that initial understanding than we think.
Exactly. So if you're designing a layout, don't just obsess about the main content area. Make sure the surrounding elements, even like the background, subtly communicate the context. People are taking that in peripherally, really quickly.
And our brains are specially wired for certain things too, aren't they? This is where it gets really interesting for me, like dedicated parts.
Yes. There's a specific bit of brain real estate. It's called the fusiform face area, or FFA.
FFA, got it.
And it's primarily dedicated to recognizing faces. Faces kind of bypass a lot of the normal visual processing, and they grab immediate automatic attention.
Huh.
And because the FFA is located really close to the amygdala, which is the brain's key area for processing emotions, faces also trigger an emotional response almost instantly.
Ugh. That explains why using faces in ads or on websites feels so powerful. It grabs attention, makes connection.
Definitely.
And the book points out, like, where the face is looking actually matters. If a person in a photo is looking at your product or maybe a sign-up button, your eyes tend to follow their gaze.
It directs your attention. Another fundamental concept linked to perception is affordances.
Affordances.
Yeah, it's the idea that objects themselves kind of give you cues about how they can or should be used. Like a handle implies pulling, right?
Yeah.
A button looks like it can be pushed.
Oh, like that classic frustrating experience with the door handle that looks like you should pull it.
But you actually have to push.
Exactly.
Precisely. That's a violation of affordance. The visual cue is mismatched with the action you need to take, and it causes that little moment of confusion, maybe frustration.
So in design, this means making interactive things look interactive, like shading on buttons, underlines on links.
Yes. Things that provide those clear visual cues.
Yeah.
Flat design, while it can look really clean visually, sometimes removes these crucial affordances.
Making it harder to know what to click on.
Yeah, exactly. Makes it harder to even figure out what you can interact with sometimes.
And speaking of figuring things out, it seems like despite all this complex processing going on, people can still miss things that seem totally obvious, like right in front of them.
Absolutely. This is the whole concept of inattentional blindness.
Right.
If you're focused on something specific or you just aren't expecting a certain stimulus, you can completely miss large, even really bizarre changes or objects right there in your visual field.
Like the famous invisible gorilla effect.
Yeah.
Where people counting basketball passes totally miss a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene.
That's the one. Or the example of TSA agents missing handguns on scans but spotting lotion bottles because they were primed. They were expecting to look for liquids.
Wow.
Right. So the crucial takeaway for design is never ever assume users will see everything you put on a screen or a product.
Don't assume anything.
Pretty much. The really important information or actions, the salient cues they have, to be incredibly clear and really prominent.
Okay, so if we're missing so much potentially, what does cut through? What grabs our attention automatically?
Well, our old brain, the more primitive part, still has a lot to say about that.
Okay.
Signals related to immediate survival things like danger, food, and sex, they're basically hardwired attention getters.
That explains why we all slow down to look at a traffic accident.
Right, or why we instantly notice really delicious-looking food photos or, attractive faces. They kind of hijack our attention.
Makes sense. What else?
Movement is a big one. Faces, as we mentioned. Stories grab attention. Loud noises, obviously.
So you can use these strategically in design, but you have to be careful, right? Because they could easily become huge distractions if they're not actually relevant to what the user is trying to do.
Exactly. Use them thoughtfully. And our attention is also dynamic. We habituate.
Habituate, meaning?
We stop noticing things that are constant or predictable or just unchanging over time, like a persistent background hum, or maybe a banner ad that never moves or changes content.
That Navy example in the book is pretty chilling, where a crew got so used to seeing all planes as friendly military aircraft that they failed to notice a commercial jet that was actually a potential risk because it just blended into the background noise for them.
It shows the danger. If you have crucial information that needs to be conveyed repeatedly, relying on a static, unchanging signal might mean it eventually just gets ignored. This ties into something called signal detection theory. Basically, our brain is constantly doing this sort of cost-benefit analysis.
Okay.
It's deciding if something is a signal, something we need to pay attention to, or if it's just irrelevant noise. And this involves trade-offs between false alarms.
Like seeing something that isn't really there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And misses failing to see something that is actually there.
Okay, like a radiologist looking for a tumor on an X-ray. A false alarm might mean, I don't know, unnecessary tests, which isn't great.
Right. But a miss could delay critical treatment, which is obviously much worse.
So the stakes are different.
Exactly. So when you're designing alerts or highlighting information, you have to consciously think about the consequences of both a false alarm and a miss in that specific context.
Right.
Should you make the signal really strong, maybe risking annoying false alarms? Or should you tone it down, which increases the risk of a critical miss?
Yeah.
It's a design decision based on those stakes.
And wrapping up the section on attention, can we just, officially retire the whole idea of multitasking? Is that fair?
Oh, please.
Yes.
The research is very, very clear on this. People don't truly multitask, not in the sense of consciously processing two complex things simultaneously.
So what are they doing?
They're task switching,
Yeah.
just very, very rapidly switching their attention back and forth. And studies even show that people who think they're good multitaskers, the high multitaskers, they're often actually worse at ignoring distractions than people who don't try to juggle multiple things.
That's fascinating and totally counterintuitive.
It is.
So the takeaway for design is don't demand true multitasking. If your design requires users to constantly switch between critical pieces of info or demands simultaneous attention on unrelated tasks, you're really making things difficult.
Yeah, you're working against the brain. Minimize distractions, especially during key workflows or critical tasks.
Okay, so we've looked at how we perceive the world, what grabs our attention. Now let's shift gears a bit to how we process information once it's actually in how we read, how we remember, and how we think.
Right. Starting with reading. There are some long-held beliefs that the source material kind of challenges.
Okay, like, are all caps really harder to read? I feel like I hear that all the time.
Yeah, it's a common one. But according to the research cited, no, not inherently harder to decode the letters themselves. All caps feel like shouting, maybe, and they're definitely less familiar because we just don't read large blocks of text that way. But the letters aren't processed much differently.
So, okay, for short bits, like headlines or emphasis, but maybe not for readability reasons for long text.
Exactly. Use them sparingly.
What about readability formulas, things like Flesch Kincaid? Are they the sort of gold standard?
They're useful tools, definitely, but they mainly measure things like word length and sentence length.
Okay.
What they don't account for, which is just as crucial for actual comprehension,
Yep.
is the reader's familiarity with the subject matter or the jargon being used.
Ah, right. So simple sentences filled with technical terms my audience doesn't know won't actually be readable, even if the formula gives it a good score.
Precisely. Context and audience knowledge matter hugely.
And the great font debate. Serif versus sans serif. Does it matter?
Well, despite decades of passionate arguments on both sides,
Yeah.
the research shows no significant, consistent difference in reading speed or comprehension between them, at least for body text on screens or paper.
Really? So it's mostly aesthetic.
Often, yeah. It comes down to aesthetic preference, brand style, or maybe specific context, but not really comprehension.
Okay, here's one that truly surprised me from the book. Line length. Like, how long should a line of text be?
Ah, yes. This one is interesting because the results seem contradictory at first.
How so?
People actually read faster with longer lines. Think maybe 80 to 100 characters per line.
Faster. Okay.
However, people prefer reading shorter lines, typically somewhere between, say, 45 and 72 characters.
Wait, so they read faster one way, but like the other way better.
Exactly. So that presents a real design trade-off, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So if you're designing something like, I don't know, a reference document for experts who just need to scan info quickly, maybe you optimize for speed with those longer lines.
Could be.
But for general web content or maybe an ebook where comfort matters more, you stick to the preferred shorter lines.
That's the kind of decision you need to make based on your specific goal and your audience, speed or comfort.
Fascinating. Okay, moving beyond just reading to memory. This seems like a huge factor into how people use anything, and the book suggests it's, well, far more unreliable than we tend to think.
Oh, absolutely. Memory is incredibly fickle.
We all heard about the magic number 7, right? Plus or minus 2, items people can hold in working memory.
Yeah, that's the classic George Miller number from the 50s. But it's a bit misleading.
Oh.
More recent and, frankly, more robust research, specifically cited from cognitive psychologist Nelson Cowan, suggests the true magic number for conscious working memory. That temporary sort of mental scratch pad you use right now is actually closer to 4 items.
4, not 7.
Yeah, 4. Maybe 3 or 5 depending on complexity, but 4 is a much better estimate for distinct chunks of information.
Wow, okay. That completely changes how you should think about presenting information. So asking a user to remember details from one screen to the next or hold multiple codes in their head.
You really need to keep it down to just a few things. Don't overload that working memory.
Got it.
And here's another crucial point about memory. It isn't like pulling a perfect file from a computer's hard drive.
No.
No. We actually reconstruct our memories every single time we access them.
Wait, reconstruct. So they're not static? They change.
They absolutely can. They can be altered by things that happen after the original event, or our brains might unconsciously fill in gaps based on our current expectations or later information we receive.
Wow.
The classic Elizabeth Loftus studies on eyewitness testimony are prime examples.
Right, I remember those. Like using different words like hit versus smashed when asking about a car crash.
Exactly. And that subtle change in wording significantly influenced people's memories, even leading some to remember seeing broken glass when there wasn't any in the video.
That's kind of alarming, actually.
It is. Or think about how a falling out with a relative later on can actually change your memory of an earlier positive interaction you had with them. You reconstruct the past through the lens of the present.
Okay, so this is incredibly important for anyone trying to understand user behavior then. It means you can't just rely solely on asking users, what did you do? Or what do you remember from past interactions?
Right, because their memory might be reconstructed or biased. Observing them doing a task in real time now is often much more accurate.
And be careful how you word questions about past experiences.
Definitely. And related to memory, forgetting isn't just a bug in the system, it's actually a feature.
A feature. How so?
It allows us to prioritize information. We need to forget stuff that's no longer relevant to make room for and focus on what is important now.
Okay, that makes sense. So good design shouldn't assume users will remember everything perfectly.
No way.
It should anticipate forgetting. It should provide easy ways to look up information, maybe access help documentation easily, or use features like drop-down menus that show the available options instead of forcing users to recall specific codes or categories from memory.
Exactly. Reduce the reliance on recall memory wherever possible.
Okay, let's shift then to thinking and how our brains process information more broadly. Our brains are incredibly powerful, obviously, but the book emphasizes they also love shortcuts. They're built for efficiency.
Yeah, that's right. They're constantly trying to conserve energy.
And they process information best in chunks, don't they? We touched on working memory, but this applies more generally.
Yes, small, manageable chunks are key.
Yeah.
The statistic cited is amazing. We can only consciously process about maybe 40 bits of information per second out of the billions hitting our senses every second.
40 out of billions. Wow.
Yeah. So overwhelming users with too much information all at once is just a surefire way to shut them down. They can't process it.
This is why that concept of progressive disclosure is so effective, right?
Absolutely.
Showing only the immediately relevant information first and then allowing users to actively choose to drill down for more detail if and only if they need it.
It respects that limited conscious processing bandwidth. The book's example of that horribly long Social Security benefits page online, just dumping everything there at once, is the perfect anti-pattern. It's overwhelming.
You need to figure out what people need most often and present that clearly up front.
Exactly. And when we talk about the mental effort involved in using something, the load, it's not all equal.
What do you mean of like clicking versus thinking?
Precisely. Thinking itself, what psychologists call cognitive load, is the most taxing type of mental processing for our brains.
Okay. More tiring than, say, looking at stuff.
Yeah. Visual processing is demanding, but generally less so than deep thinking or problem solving. And then motor tasks, like physically clicking a mouse or typing on a keyboard, are usually the least taxing of the three.
Okay, so if you can make a trade-off in your design, maybe add an extra click or two, which is motor load.
Right.
If it significantly reduces the amount the user has to think or remember or figure out the cognitive load, you should probably make that trade.
Absolutely. People often perceive something as easy, not because it had the fewest possible steps, but because it required the least amount of thinking.
Minimize cognitive load. That's the goal.
That's a huge goal for intuitive design.
This connects to mental models too, doesn't it? This idea that people don't come to a product as a blank slate. They have expectations.
Yes, absolutely. They arrive with an existing mental model, a sort of internal representation of how something like this should work, based on all their past experiences with similar things.
Like expecting a new website to have navigation at the top or a shopping cart icon somewhere.
Right. And the designer, meanwhile, builds a conceptual model into the product how they intend it to work.
Okay.
Intuitive design happens when the product's conceptual model closely matches the user's pre-existing mental model. Things just work the way they expect.
And if it's a completely new concept, something they have no existing model for.
Then you'll need to provide clear guidance, maybe onboarding tutorials or some kind of training to help them build an accurate new mental model. The example of a first-time Kindle user expecting it to behave exactly like a physical book or maybe like a different brand of e-reader they used before illustrates this perfectly. Their existing model might not quite fit.
And a really powerful way to help people understand information, build those mental models, and remember things, especially complex stuff, seems to be using stories and examples.
Oh, massively powerful. The human brain seems fundamentally wired for narrative.
We love stories.
We do. Information presented as a story or illustrated with clear, concrete examples is far more engaging, much easier to understand, and way more memorable than just abstract concepts or dry lists of facts.
The anecdote in the book about the speaker grabbing the attention of a totally distracted audience by just starting with a dramatic story about Navy radar operators.
Yeah, that's a great illustration.
It immediately pulled them in. Or just thinking about instructions showing a screenshot or even a short video clip of how to do something is often way better than providing a long, dense list of text steps.
Use stories, use visuals, use concrete examples. It works.
Okay, speaking of people maybe holding on to existing ideas quite strongly, confirmation bias is a big one mentioned.
Huge one. People actively seek out and pay more attention to information that confirms what they already believe. and they tend to ignore or discount information that contradicts their beliefs.
And if you directly challenge those beliefs, tell them they're flat out wrong.
They might actually dig in their heels even harder. It can backfire.
So what's a better approach, according to the book?
Don't just confront them. Start by acknowledging their existing perspective. Show you understand where they're coming from. Then gently introduce alternative ideas or evidence. Sometimes, getting a small commitment to an action that maybe subtly contradicts their belief can create a bit of internal conflict, cognitive dissonance, and that might open them up to shifting their thinking over time. It's a gradual process.
Fascinating. And finally, in this sort of processing section, the idea of flow state, that feeling of being totally absorbed.
Yes, that wonderful state of deep concentration and enjoyment where time seems to fly. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept.
Right. Can design help create that?
It can facilitate it, definitely, by
Okay.
creating environments that minimize distractions, provide clear goals, give immediate feedback, and crucially maintain a good balance between the user's perceived skills and the challenge of the task.
Not too easy, not too hard.
Exactly. Keep
Right.
them in that channel. It's highly individual, of course, but minimizing interruptions is probably the biggest factor designers can control.
Okay, great. Let's pivot now to the next big area, why we do what we do. Looking at the drivers behind our actions, things like motivation, our social nature, and the role of feelings.
Right. And motivation, it turns out, isn't always what we think it is,
Right.
or what people say motivates them.
Okay.
One of the most powerful forces driving seeking behavior, getting people to keep doing something, is the concept of variable reward.
Variable rewards, meaning unpredictable.
Exactly. Rewards that are unpredictable, that don't come on a fixed schedule. Think slot machines, or maybe more relevantly today, refreshing your social media feed or checking email. You don't know what you'll get or when you'll get something good.
And that unpredictability is the key.
It's incredibly motivating. Dopamine systems in the brain go wild. Our brain actually shows more activity anticipating a potential reward in these variable situations than when it actually receives the reward itself.
Wow. It's the seeking, the hunt that's so compelling, like Skinner's famous experiments with rats pressing levers for unpredictable food pellets.
It's the same fundamental principle. It really makes you wonder if certain app designs, maybe with variable notifications or unpredictable content updates, are inadvertently creating these powerful, sometimes problematic dopamine loops.
Something designers need to be really mindful of, the potential addictive quality.
Absolutely. You have to understand that power. The book also highlights the important difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation.
Okay, intrinsic being internal drives, extrinsic being external rewards.
Right. People are often more strongly and sustainably motivated by internal factors, things like feeling a sense of progress, achieving mastery in a skill, having autonomy or control over what they're doing, especially for tasks they find inherently interesting or enjoyable.
And external rewards, like money, points, badges.
They can work, especially for boring tasks, but they can also backfire. Particularly, expected external reward can actually decrease intrinsic motivation for an enjoyable task. If you start paying someone for something they like doing for free, and then you stop paying them, they might stop doing it altogether.
That study with the children drawing is a classic example. Right.
Exactly. The kids who expected a reward for drawing actually spent less time drawing later on, when the reward was gone, compared to kids who got an unexpected reward or no reward at all. The expected reward undermined their internal enjoyment.
So the takeaway is focus on helping users feel progress, mastery, and control.
Yes. For tasks that are inherently boring or tedious, the book suggests simply acknowledging that it's boring, validating that feeling, and allowing people some autonomy in how they complete the task can actually help motivation more than just throwing points at them.
Interesting. And another core idea about motivation is that people are fundamentally, lazy.
Or perhaps more charitably efficient.
Okay, efficient. Hardwired to conserve energy?
Yes, exactly. We are biologically driven to conserve energy. So we'll typically do the least amount of work necessary to achieve a goal that feels good enough.
This is that principle of satisficing, right?
Right. People don't usually exhaustively search for the absolute optimal solution. They search until they find one that meets their minimum criteria, one that's satisfactory, and then they stop searching.
Which, from a design perspective, makes providing really easy to find shortcuts and sensible, smart defaults absolutely crucial.
Make the easy path the desired path.
But don't assume everyone will use the shortcut, even if it's faster. Some will stick to the familiar, longer way if it feels less effortful mentally.
That's true too. An interesting point mentioned on competition motivation is something called the N effect.
and effect.
Yeah, N being the number of competitors. It seems we are actually more motivated to compete. We try harder when there are fewer competitors around us.
Really? Why's that?
The thinking is our perceived chance of winning, of coming out on top, feels higher when the pool is smaller. It feels more attainable.
Like that study showing SAT scores were actually higher on average in testing rooms with fewer students taking the test at the same time.
Exactly. Fewer competitors, higher motivation, better performance. That's something to definitely consider if you're designing any kind of competitive feature or gamified experience. Group size matters.
Okay. Beyond individual motivation, we're also fundamentally social animals. This influences us deeply even when we're interacting online or with digital products.
Hugely. It's core to who we are.
There's the famous Dunbar's number, for instance.
Right, the idea proposed by anthropologist Robin Dunbar that there's a cognitive limit to the number of stable social relationships we can maintain, people we know well, trust, have reciprocal obligations with. That number seems to be around 150.
Our strong ties.
Yes. But the book also notes that weak ties, our acquaintances, people we don't know as well, are still really important, especially for things like getting new information or finding opportunities.
So understanding those different group dynamics is important for online communities or social features.
Definitely. And we are also wired for imitation and empathy, partly thanks to mirror neurons in the brain.
Mirror neurons.
Yeah, and neurons that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action. It helps us understand and imitate others.
So just showing videos of people performing a desired behavior, like the examples given are getting a flu shot or maybe kids eating healthy vegetables,
Can actually encourage others watching to do the same thing. We mirror and learn socially.
and doing things together synchronously seems to build bonds.
Yes, even simple synchronous activities like singing together, walking in step, chanting. Research shows these activities increase feelings of bonding, trust, and cooperation within a group.
Something to think about for designing shared online experiences where you want to foster community.
Could be. And crucially, for anyone designing digital experiences, we tend to expect our online interactions, even with inanimate websites, apps, or software, to follow the same unwritten social rules we apply to person-to-person interactions.
That's powerful. Explain that a bit more.
Well, think about it. A website that takes ages to load. It feels like someone is ignoring you, being rude.
Right. Or a site that immediately asks for lots of personal information before providing any value.
It feels like someone you just met getting way too personal, way too quickly. It violates social norms.
So many basic usability guidelines like being responsive, being clear, asking for info only when needed. They're essentially just digital translations of good social etiquette.
Exactly. Treat the user with respect, like you would in a face-to-face conversation. And the medium of communication itself can also influence things, like, surprisingly, honesty.
Really? How so? People lie differently depending on how they communicate.
Apparently, yes. Research cited shows people tend to lie most often when talking on the phone.
Huh. More than in person.
Seems so. And they lie least when writing something down with good old pen and paper. Email and instant messaging fall somewhere in between phone and paper.
Wow. Why would that be? Less record, maybe. Less immediate feedback.
Possibly a combination of factors: perceived permanence, social distance, ease of deception. People are also apparently more likely to express negative opinions or be more critical via email than they would face-to-face or even on paper.
Okay, so if you're collecting user feedback through surveys or reviews, the medium you choose, online form versus phone call versus paper survey, could significantly impact how honest or how negative the responses you get are.
Absolutely could. In-person feedback, while maybe harder to get, is often the most accurate reflection of people's true feelings and observed behaviors.
Good to know.
And just the act of communicating effectively is deeply social. Studies using brain imaging show that speakers' and listeners' brains actually synchronize their activity patterns during successful communication.
They sync up, like literally.
Yeah, certain areas fire in similar patterns. And the degree of this brain syncing correlates strongly with how well the listener understands what the speaker is trying to convey. It's a neural marker of shared understanding.
That's amazing. Okay, shifting gears again. Let's talk about feelings. Emotion. It's not just some fluffy extra, is it? So the book argues it's fundamental to how we function, even how we make decisions.
Absolutely critical. Research with people who have specific types of brain injuries that prevent them from feeling emotions normally shows they have incredible difficulty making even simple decisions. They can analyze options logically, weigh pros and cons, but they can't actually choose a path.
So emotion provides necessary input, like a gut feeling.
It seems so. It helps us evaluate the potential outcomes and assign value to different options. Even temporary changes, like studies involving Botox that limits facial feedback for emotions, showed participants had more trouble processing emotional information and, consequently, making effective decisions.
Wow. So feeling is necessary for deciding.
Seems that way. Our brains also seem really wired to enjoy positive, unexpected surprises, novelty, and delight.
We like good surprises.
We really do. That fMRI study cited, where the brain's reward centers lit up most strongly when a pleasant reward like a squirt of juice was delivered unexpectedly.
More than when it was predictable.
Yes, more than when they knew it was coming. It's the surprise element that adds that extra kick of pleasure. So building in moments of genuine, positive, but maybe unpredictable delight into an experience can be very engaging for users.
And surprisingly, maybe counterintuitively, being busy seems to make us happier, as long as the task feels worthwhile.
Yeah, that bracelet study mentioned is a great example. People were given a choice. Sit idly for 15 minutes, or spend that time taking apart and rebuilding a simple Lego bracelet.
Okay.
Most chose to do the task, even though it was pointless work. And they reported feeling happier doing it, especially if they were told they could redesign the bracelet however they liked afterwards, giving it a sense of purpose.
So people prefer having something meaningful to do, even if it's low level, rather than just being idle.
Seems so. Give users meaningful ways to engage, maybe even while they're waiting for something else to happen, like a download to complete.
We also seem to have this innate evolutionary preference for certain types of environments, don't we?
Yes, particularly natural scenes. Pastoral landscapes with specific features like open grassy areas, scattered trees, especially ones you could climb or hide behind. The presence of water, maybe a path leading off into the distance.
The kind of landscape that was good for survival for our ancestors.
That's the evolutionary psychology theory, yes. These scenes feel inherently safe and calming to us. Even just having a view through a window seems beneficial.
That study showing hospital patients recovering faster if their room had a window overlooking nature.
It's compelling evidence. So, where appropriate, incorporating natural imagery or even just providing a sense of an open view in a digital space might positively impact mood and well-being.
And speaking of well-being, a really big factor seems to be the feeling of trust.
Yes, huge. Studies looking at national levels of happiness find that the average level of trust people report having in others is one of the strongest predictors of overall well-being in that society.
Trust is fundamental.
Which makes designing cues that build trust absolutely critical for any product or service. This includes things like, a professional visual design, clear and credible information, transparency about how data is used, guarantees, social proof, consistent and reliable performance.
This whole package.
It is. And users often rely heavily on that initial look and feel as a quick heuristic, a first indicator of trustworthiness, even before they dig into the details. First impressions matter for trust.
Okay, let's tackle our final major section. When things go wrong, and right. This focuses on mistakes and how we actually make decisions. First big point. People will make mistakes, right? It's inevitable.
It is simply impossible to design any non-trivial system that completely eliminates human error, especially for complex tasks.
You can try, but you'll never get to zero errors.
Pretty much. As the stakes get higher, think aviation, medical devices, you invest enormous effort and cost to minimize errors and mitigate their consequences, using things like checklists, redundancies, forcing functions. But you'll still never reach 100% fail-safe. Humans are involved.
So the practical approach for most design has to be design assuming errors will happen.
Yes. Anticipate common errors.
Which means providing clear, understandable error messages. Messages that don't just say error, but explain what went wrong, ideally why, and crucially how the user can fix it.
Exactly. Help them recover easily. Though, of course, the very best error message is the one you never have to show.
Because you designed the system to prevent the error from happening in the first place, through better defaults, constraints, or clearer guidance.
That's the ideal, yes. Error prevention over error messaging. Stress is also a major factor that increases errors.
Oh, yeah. How does stress impact performance?
There's the classic Yerkes-Dodson law. It basically shows that performance increases with arousal or stress, but only up to an optimal point.
Okay.
After that point, especially for complex tasks, performance sharply declines as stress gets too high. People get overwhelmed, Their focus narrows.
Tunnel vision.
Right. And under really high stress, people can fall into something called tunnel action, where they get stuck just repeating the same action over and over, even if it's clearly not working.
Like frantically clicking the same broken button on a complex medical website while you're incredibly stressed about a sick loved one.
Exactly that kind of scenario.
Yeah.
So identifying those potentially high-stress user situations or contexts and radically simplifying the design, reducing cognitive load, making the path forward incredibly clear in those specific contexts is crucial.
Design for the stressed user.
Yes. But it's also worth noting, not all mistakes are necessarily bad. In some contexts, like learning a new software or exploring options, making errors can actually lead to exploration, discovery, and deeper learning.
As long as the consequences aren't severe.
Precisely. For things like medical devices or financial transactions, error prevention and robust, easy recovery are absolutely paramount. No room for playful exploration there.
Okay. And when it comes to how we actually make decisions, we like to think we're these rational, logical beings carefully weighing all the options.
That's the story we tell ourselves, yes.
Yeah.
Our conscious mind likes to feel in charge.
But the research.
The research, particularly from neuroscience and behavioral economics over the last few decades, overwhelmingly shows that most decisions are made primarily by unconscious processes, often very quickly, based on emotion, heuristics, past experiences.
So the conscious mind does what? Justifies it afterwards.
Often, yes. The conscious mind frequently kicks in after the unconscious decision has effectively been made, primarily to construct a logical-sounding reason or rationalization for it. We confabulate explanations for our choices.
The Iowa gambling task described in the book is a fantastic illustration of this, isn't it?
It really is. People playing this card game started showing physiological stress responses, sweaty palms when hovering over the risky decks, long before they could consciously articulate why those decks were bad or which decks were safer.
Their unconscious mind, their gut, figured it out first.
Way before conscious awareness caught up.
Yeah.
So again, for understanding users, observing what they actually do is often far more revealing than just asking them why they did it, because they might not consciously know the real drivers.
Design needs to appeal to those unconscious motivations, those gut feelings, but also provide the clear information and reasons that the conscious mind can use to justify the decision later.
Well put. You need both. People also strongly equate having choices with feeling in control. This is a powerful psychological need.
Even if having too many choices actually makes the decision harder or leads to worse outcomes, the paradox of choice.
Yes, even then. People often prefer situations that offer more choices, even if some choices are functionally identical or if the process is slightly less efficient overall, simply because it gives them that feeling of agency and control.
Like those studies showing both monkeys and humans preferring to press multiple buttons or spin multiple roulette reels, even if they all led to the exact same random outcome.
Exactly. It feels better to have options, even if they're illusory. So offering choices where appropriate, even seemingly minor ones, can be important for user satisfaction because it taps into that need for control.
And conversely, be very careful about removing choices in updates or redesigns. Users often react very negatively to losing options they previously had, even if they rarely use them.
Yes, loss aversion combined with loss of control. Bad combo. Our mood also seems to influence the way we make decisions.
Okay, how so? Happy versus sad?
Yeah. Research suggests people in a happy mood tend to rely more on intuition and heuristics. And interestingly, they tend to value things higher if they make decisions intuitively while happy.
Okay, and sad mood?
People in a sad mood tend to engage in more deliberative, analytical, systematic thinking. And they tend to value things higher if they make decisions using that more effortful, deliberative process while sad.
Huh. So subtle design choices that might influence a user's mood, like using positive imagery, maybe uplifting music or colors, could potentially impact not just their feeling, but how they approach decisions related to your product or service, making them more intuitive or more analytical.
It's possible. It suggests mood isn't just a byproduct. It can actively shape the cognitive style we use for decision-making.
Fascinating. In group decision-making, the book warns about groupthink.
Yes, a classic pitfall. Specifically, if group members share their initial preferences or opinions before everyone has had a chance to thoroughly review all the relevant information independently, they tend to anchor on those initial preferences and pay less attention to subsequent information, especially details that contradict the emerging group consensus. This often leads to poorer quality decisions.
So the solution is process discipline.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Ensure individuals review all the key information on their own first, form their own initial assessment before coming together as a group to discuss preferences and make a collective decision. Avoid premature convergence.
Get independent thoughts before group influence kicks in.
Exactly. And finally, the book touches on how decisions driven by habit seem to happen in a different part of the brain than decisions that involve consciously evaluating values and options.
Okay, like the difference between just automatically clicking renew subscription versus actively comparing different plans and deciding whether to upgrade.
Precisely. The first is largely habit-based, running on autopilot. The second requires engaging the value assessment parts of the brain.
So how does design influence this?
Well, simply presenting clear options like showing alternatives to the default subscription or highlighting the benefits of upgrading can effectively interrupt the habit loop and push someone from that automatic habit-based mode into a more value-based conscious decision mode.
So if you want users to stick with the default habit, maybe don't show them lots of alternatives.
Could be a strategy.
Yeah.
Keep it simple. Make the habitual path frictionless.
But if you want them to actively consider upgrading or changing, you need to present those options clearly to trigger that value-based evaluation.
Exactly. You nudge them out of the habit track. And always remember that a lot of these subtle, unconscious influences are constantly at play. Things like ratings, reviews, social proof, scarcity cues.
The things people rarely admit influence them.
Right? Because they often aren't consciously aware of the influence. So trust their behavior more than their stated reasons when these kinds of unconscious factors are likely involved in their decision.
Wow. Okay. We have truly taken a deep dive today, haven't we? Pulling out some really surprising, sometimes counterintuitive insights directly from the science about how we humans actually see, think, feel, and act.
Yeah, from the way our peripheral vision and, that primal brain grab attention, often way below our conscious awareness,
Right.
to the frankly shocking realities of how unreliable and reconstructive our memory is, and just how much of our decision-making seems to happen unconsciously, driven by emotion and shortcuts.
And the incredible value here, I think, is how practical these insights really are. Understanding these fundamental aspects of human behavior isn't just like interesting trivia for psychologists.
Not at all.
It fundamentally changes how you might think about designing pretty much anything, a product, a website, a presentation, an email campaign.
Or even just how you communicate with and try to understand other people in your daily life.
Exactly. It helps you create experiences that feel more intuitive, more natural, more engaging, and ultimately more effective because they work with the grain of how human brains are actually wired instead of fighting against it.
Working with human nature, not against it. That's a good way to put it.
So what does this all really mean for you listening? I think it means that truly connecting with people, whether you're designing something for them or just interacting with them, requires this constant curiosity, a willingness to look beyond what seems obvious on the surface.
Yeah, because so much of what truly drives our behavior, from what we even notice in the first place to the choices we ultimately make, is happening beneath the surface of our conscious thought. There's a lot going on under the hood.
Definitely.
So maybe here's something to consider as you go about your day after listening to this. If so much of our interaction with the world, from simply perceiving information accurately to making really important choices, is guided by these unconscious processes, these deep-seated heuristics, and these powerful evolutionary instincts,
Yeah.
what does that truly imply about the nature of free will? How much of your daily experience, your choices, your reactions is really within your conscious, deliberate control? Something to perhaps mull over as you navigate the world, both the design parts and the very human parts around you.